Safas lecturer, Lisa Fredman, who teaches in Ephrata, and is a well-known and beloved Magidat Shiurim in Efrat and beyond. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Sarah. Okay, thanks, Sarah Jo. Boker Tov to everyone, and Shana Tova. I'm going to start with sharing the screen. Great. Okay. During the shiur, if people have questions, I'm going to try to remember to stop at certain points to answer questions. You can put questions in the chat box. If I don't remember during the shiur, then at the end of the shiur, okay? I apologize. Sometimes you get so involved that you forget about stopping. On Shabbat morning, we're all going to be sitting down somewhere under a tree, in the house, in a shul, and we're going to be listening to the Kriyat Torah for the first day of Rosh Hashanah. And Chazal chose Breshit chapter 21 as the Torah reading. And today I'd like to investigate that chapter and see why it was chosen. Now, at first glance, it's clear why it was chosen, because the Gemara tells us, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara at page 11 Aleph says, on Rosh Hashanah, Sarah and Rachel and Chana were remembered. From where do we know this? Rav Elazar said it was derived through a Gzeira Shava of Kida Pikida, and it was derived through a Gzeira Shava of Zechira Zechira. Gzeira Shava is a hermeneutical device. It's like an equal sign. When a word is found in two different verses, Chazal sometimes put them together with an equal sign and compare the two. So what is the Gemara basically saying? It's going through a few stages. It's noticing that the root Zachar, to remember, is mentioned regarding Rachel and Chana, as we can see on the chart here, Vayizkor Elokim et Rachel, Vayiftach et Rachma, and regarding Chana, Vayeda Elkana et Chana Ishto, Vayizkereh Hashem. And then the same root, Zayin Chaf Reish, is mentioned regarding Rosh Hashanah. B'chodesh hashvi'i ve'echad l'chodesh, yeh lechem Shabbaton zichron tru'ah. So the first step in the equation is that the root Zachar is found in these different locations, and they're connected. How are they connected? That Rachel and Chana were given conception, they became pregnant by God on Rosh Hashanah. So that's stage number one. What's stage number two? Chazal realized that there's another word in Tanakh which describes giving conception from God, and that's the root pakad in the blue. Ki pakad Hashem et Chana, ki pakad Hashem pakad et Sarah. So Chazal equated the two verbs, Zachar equals pakad. And what's the third step in the rabbinic thought? Just like Zechira happened on Rosh Hashanah, so too Pikida happened on Rosh Hashanah, and therefore Chazal deduced that Sarah also conceived on Rosh Hashanah. And that is the reason, very clearly, why chapter 21 in Sefer Breshit was chosen. Because chapter 21 begins, Hashem pakad et Sarah kasher amar, vayas Hashem le Sarah kasher diber, v'tzahar v'teled Sarah la'avram ben lizkunav l'moed asher diber ito Elohim. Our Torah reading begins with the fact that Sarah was remembered and she became pregnant. And according to Chazal, this happened on Rosh Hashanah. The first few verses in the chapter describe her giving birth, and eventually she weans the child. And if we skip to Pasuk Chet, okay, the last verse in that first section, Vayigdal hayeled vayigamal, vayas Avraham mishte gadol biyom higamel et Yitzchak. So on the day that he is weaned, Yitzchak is weaned, a party is made. And that's the first part of our chapter. The chapter then goes on to a totally related story, focusing on Hagar and Ishmael. At that party, what happens? Vateres Hagar et ben Hagar hamitzrit asher yalda Abraham mitzachek. Sarah sees the son of Hagar mitzachek playing. We'll see what that means in a moment. And after that, she demands that they be expelled from the house. And my question this morning is, what additional message for Rosh Hashanah can we find in this second story? in the chapter. Like I said, clearly we're reading this Torah reading because of what's in the beginning of the chapter. But I believe that if we look carefully at the second story, we're going to find a beautiful message for us, Rosh Hashanah this year. So let's take a very close look at Breshit, chapter 21, the second narrative in the chapter. And we'll be looking at the story through three vantage points. The vantage point of Abraham, Hagar, and then Ishmael. So like we said earlier, Sarah sees the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, playing. Now, playing seems to be a very benign word, but let's keep in mind that Hagar's son Ishmael is playing with Yitzchak, and there is about a 17-year difference in age difference between Ishmael and Yitzchak. We know that because Abraham is 86 years old when Ishmael is born, and he's 100 when Yitzchak is born. So that's 14 years. And this playing is happening during the weaning celebration, which happened when Yitzchak was about 2 or 3 years old. So therefore, Ishmael is around 16 or 17 years old. So Sarah sees Ishmael playing, and notice, Sarah doesn't call Ishmael by his name. We're going to take a very close look at how characters are mentioned, how they're termed in this chapter. She calls him the son of Hagar the Egyptian. So she sees this playing going on. V'tomer la'Avraham garesh et ha'ma'azot be'et b'na, ki lo yirash ben ha'ma'azot im b'nei Yitzchak. Send out, expel this handmaiden and her son, because he will not inherit with my son Yitzchak. So we need to understand, what does this mitzachek mean? What kind of behavior is going on? So the Ibn Ezra, the medieval commentator Ibn Ezra explains, Ki chen min ha'kol na'ar. This is the way of all children. V'tikanebo ba'avor hayoto gadol mimena. And that Sarah was jealous because Ishmael was older than her son. So according to Ibn Ezra, it was mere child's play. Rashi, based on the Tosefta, brings another explanation. And Rashi sees very, very serious and dangerous behavior on the side of Ishmael. Rashi says, mitzachek, lashon avodah zarah. It was being involved in some type of idolatry. And how does Rashi know that? Kemoshe ne'emar, as it says, vayakumu letzachek. The same root, letzachek, is used by the chet ha'egel. And there we know the people got up and they danced and they played around the egel. It was some type of celebration, idolater celebration. So therefore, Rashi infers, the Midrash infers, that Ishmael was involved in some type of avodah zarah. That's what the word mitzachek means. Rashi's second explanation, lashon giloi arayot. It was some type of inappropriate sexual behavior, and he learns this from the pasuk litzachek bi. That's the story of Eshet Potiphar. When Eshet Potiphar says to David, says to Yosef, and blames her husband that you sent this man to play with me. And the third explanation, lashon utzicha, it was dangerous play. Yakumu naha ne'arim v'yisachaku lefanenu. And Rashi brings a verse from Sefer Shmuel to explain that it's a type of like war games that were going on. Okay, so according to Rashi, based on the Tosefta, we are talking about very serious activities, not mere child's play. And it's interesting that we're not highlighting here the 3 cardinal sins, right? And that's what precipitates Sarah saying, this child has to leave the house. The Tosefta brings another explanation, and that's the explanation of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. And what does he say? ואני אומר, חס ושלום שיהיה בביתו של אותו צדיק ההוא. כך אפשר למי שנאמר עליו כי ידעתיו למען אשר יצווה וגומר, יהיה בביתו עבודה זרה וגילוי עריות ושפיכות דמים. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai says, is it possible that Abraham's house, who we know is instructing his children to follow in the right way, we'd have the 3 cardinal sins happening? Ella ein schok ha'amur kan, ella enyan Yerusha. So what does it mean that he was playing? Kishenolad Abraham, Yitzchak la'Abraham Avinu, היו הכל שמחים ואומרים, נולד בן לאברהם, נולד בן לאברהם, נאכל את העולם ונוטל פי שני חלקים. When Yitzchak was born, everyone was joy, saying, oh, a son has been born to him, and he's going to be the Bechor, and he's going to receive the double portion. And Ishmael was chuckling, and he was ridiculing and laughing inside, saying, Al tu shotim, don't be stupid. Al tu shotim, ani Bechor, ani notel shnei chalakim. I am really the firstborn, and I'm going to take the 2 double portion. Shemechuvat hadavar talomed ki lo yirash ben ha'mahazot. So according to this opinion of Tosefta, he was mocking and he was ridiculing, and he's saying, I'm going to be the one to inherit. And that links nicely into the second verse here, when Sarah says, expel him because he will not inherit with my son Yitzchak. I want to go back for a moment to the idea that perhaps Ishmael was involved in some type of inappropriate sexual activity. And it's just interesting to point out that the chapters preceding ours all somehow touch on this idea of sexuality. It starts in chapter 17, where we have the mitzvah of Brit Milah. And as we know, the mitzvah of Brit Milah is on the male sexual organ. And the Radak says something very interesting regarding this sign. He says, this is the strongest of all these signs that we have in Judaism, because it's actually on the body, like no other. Okay, why on that organ was the sign given? Because this is an organ which is the one where most sins happen through it. It's the head of the animal instinct in man. And when man is about to sin in sexual relations, he's supposed to look at that sign of the Brit Milah, Asherbo, which is on his organ. So the Radak is something very, very pertinent to today, right? That the sexual organ is the one which is often used to sin, and the Brit Milah is purposely put on that to remind the Jews, stop, think, and refrain. And of course, in chapters 18 and 19, the story of Sodom, we have the idea of Lot's daughters sleeping with their father in the cave. Chapter 20, Sarah in the house of Avimelech. Avimelech wants to have relations with her, and then God saves her. Also, we're talking about sexual relations, and of course, we have now Ishmael playing. So if you look at the contextual reading of the chapters preceding ours, it could be that there is a hint to this idea that maybe mitzvah chayk here is referring to that opinion in Rashi that has to do with inappropriate sexual behavior. In any event, no matter what the playing is, what does she demand, Sarah? Expel the child and his mother. And the question is, why? Pasuk says, Garesh et hamahazot ve'bena ki lo yirash ben hamazot ibni Yitzchak. What's the connection between expelling and inheritance? And here, if we look at the ancient law code of the laws of Hammurabi, I think it can give us a better understanding behind what Sarah is actually asking. In the laws of Hammurabi, code number 170, what does it say? If his wife bears sons to a man, or his maidservant has born sons, and the father, while still living, says to the children whom his maidservant has born, my sons, and he counts them with the sons of his wife, if then the father dies, then the sons of the wife and of the maidservant shall divide the paternal property in common. So if during the lifetime of the father, he makes it seem, or he makes the declaration that the children of the maidservant, the sons, of the maidservant are his sons, then they will inherit equally with the sons of his wife. But now we have the caveat in law number 171. If, however, the father, while still living, did not say to the sons of the maidservant, my sons, and then the father dies, the sons of the maidservant shall not share with the sons of the wife, but the freedom of the maid and her sons shall be granted. The sons of the wife shall have no right to enslave the sons of the maid. Okay, so if during that lifetime, the father never clearly states, this is my son, regarding the son of the maidservant, then that son will not inherit and he will go free. So what do we see here? We see that what's happening now is Sarah is demanding from Abraham to expel Ishmael. By expelling Ishmael, what is she in a sense doing? She's legally declaring, this is not my son in terms of inheritance. And it's not my son, but by declaring that it's not my son, that child deserves to go free. So in exchange for his inheritance rights, in a sense, this expulsion of Ishmael will grant him his freedom. So that's a little bit of the background to what Sarah is doing, and we can understand better her demand. So this is what she is demanding from her husband. What is Abraham's reaction? It was very bad in his eyes. This is a very, very unusual phrase, very bad. Very bad in the eyes of Abraham regarding his son. And of course, we can understand that. This has been his son for 17 years, and now he needs to expel the son from his home. But God intervenes, Vayomer Elohim el Abraham, Al Yera, Al Avdecha, Al Vatecha, Kol Asher Tomer Lecha Sarah Shma Bekola, Ki B'Yitzchak Yikare Lecha Zara. God intervenes and says, hearken to Sarah's voice, and don't feel bad about your son, the Al Amatecha, your son and your maidservant. It's interesting. The previous verse just mentions Abraham's concern about his son, but God, knowing the hearts of man, adds the Al Amatecha. Abraham is not only concerned about his son, but he's also concerned about Hagar. After all, they've been married for more than 17 years. But God says, listen to Sarah, send him away. He will not inherit you in terms of the bracha of Abraham, but God reassures him, Pasuk Gimel, V'gam et ben ha'ama l'goy asimenu. He will be, you're the son of the mate, Ishmael will be a nation. Okay, he will not be forgotten. He won't inherit the special bracha that I will give you and your descendants, but he will be the father of a nation, and that will sustain him. Now, it's interesting that we're reading our story as of now, until now, in a vacuum. We're reading chapter 21 independently. But 17 years earlier, when Abraham first, Hagar is given to Abraham for the first time, we have a little bit of a similar scenario. What happens is, 17 years earlier, Sarah is barren, and after 10 years of living in Eretz Yisrael without a child, she gives Hagar to Abraham as a wife. And if we look in Pasuk Dalet, the second paragraph, Vayavo el Hagar v'tzahar. Okay, so he has relations with Hagar, and she gets pregnant. Vaterei ki harata, and she sees that she's pregnant. Vatekel gvirta be'eineha, and she starts, and the esteem of the mistress of Sarah is lowered in her eyes, in Hagar's eyes, because she's pregnant, right? And the mistress isn't. And she starts not listen. The text doesn't tell us, but we can understand, we can infer that she starts showing the fact that she's pregnant and Sarah is not. And it could be that she even stops listening to what Sarah asked her to do. And Pesukei, Vatomer Sarai el Avram, Chamasi alecha, my injustice is yours. Anochi natati shivchati b'chekecha v'tireki harata ve'ekel be'eineha, yishpot Hashem be'ni u'leinecha. And she says to Abraham, you see that I've been demeaned in her eyes, and nothing's being done. Vayomer Avram el Sarai, hine shivchatech beyadech, my servant is in your hand. Asila hatov be'einayich, do whatever you want with her, whatever is good in your eyes. V'ta'aneha Sarai, and Sarah afflicted her, v'tivrach mifaneh, and she runs away. So 17 years earlier, when we have this kind of altercation between, which is our triangle of Hagar, Sarah, and Abraham, 17 years previously, what does Abraham say? Do what's good in your eyes. Do what's good in your eyes. And she afflicts Sarai, and Abraham doesn't seem to say a word. And now, 17 years later, when we have this triangle where it's become a little bit more complicated, it's no longer just Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, but there's also Ishmael. Here already, Abraham is not passive. Abraham doesn't respond in any way, but rather, Vayira hadavar me'od. Notice the contrast. The word Vayira here in chapter 21, whereas in chapter 16, Tov, do what's Tov be'enayich. The Ramban and others are very bothered by Abraham's behavior 17 years earlier, and they actually say that he sinned inadvertently by allowing Sarah to do what she did. In any event, we see his immediate reaction is concern, but clearly God has said to him, this is what you need to do, and this is what he needs to do. So Sarah demands, now look carefully, expel this woman and her child. And now let's read the actualization. Let's see what Abraham actually does. Vayashkem Abraham baboker. Like we know Abraham, he gets up in the morning because God told him he has to do this. Vayikach lechem v'chemat mayim, he takes bread and water. Vayitein el Hagar sam al shichma, and he puts it on her shoulder. Vet hayeled, and the child. Vayishalcheha, and he sends her. Now notice the words here. Sarah utilized the word garesh, and Abraham uses, when he sends her away, the term uses vayishalcheha. Is there a difference between these two words? Let's take a look, right? In Sefer Shmot, where we see the word vayigaresh, it has to do with at the well of water, when the daughters of Yitro come to try to water their flock, and the Ro'im are trying to send them away. What do we told them? Pasuk Zayin, Vayavo HaRo'im Vayigarshu. Okay, and they push them away. And Moshe comes and saves them. Let's look at the use of the word vayishalach, lishloach, to send in the PL. In Sefer Breshit, in Parshat Noach, vayishalach et hayonah me'ito, virot hakalu hamayim me'al panah. And Noach opens up the ark, right? And he sends out the dove to see if the water had abated from the ground. So if we look at these two verbs, we see that there could be a slight nuance of difference. Legaresh seems to be expelled from, whereas vayishalach is more an idea of sending to. And if that's the case, what do we see here? That there's a change of focus regarding the sending away in the eyes of Abraham. He has to listen because God said this is the right thing to do. But instead of legaresh, instead of focusing on expelling from, he is sending to. He's softening the sending away. After all, he realizes from God's promise that Ishmael's destiny awaits him in the desert, awaits him outside of his own home. So he's softening it and sending him to his destiny. A slight nuance, but a world of difference. Let's look at another example between l'shaleach and legaresh. In chapter 3 in Sefer Breshit, when Adam and Eve are sent out of the Garden of Eden, what does it say? Vayishalcheu Hashem Elokim migan Eden lavodat ha'adama asher lukach misham. And they were sent from Gan Eden to work the land where they had been created from. So they're being sent from, but the focus of the verse is on what? On where they're going to be going in order to work the land, sending to. Whereas the next pasuk, which uses the phrase vayigaresh et ha'adam, vayashkein mikedem lagan eden hakruvim ve'et lahat hacherev hamitapechet lishmor et derech eitz hachayim, and Adam was expelled from the Garden of Eden, and angels are put there with swords so that he cannot return. Here we see the word vayigaresh is really expelling from. So and Aaron Pinker, who wrote an article discussing these two words, notes that garesh is departure from, and notes a severance of ties, whereas lishloach is more to send to, an extension of reach. So Abraham sends them off. Vayashkem Abraham baboker. Vayikach lechem v'chemat mayim vayiten ha'agar sam al shichma ve'et hayeled vayishalcheha. If we didn't know where this child and woman were being sent, this is a beautiful verse. I find this very poignant. I find this very gentle. And Abraham got up in the morning and he placed water and he placed bread on her shoulder, on Hagar's shoulder. How intimate, he placed it on her shoulder, and the child, and he sends them. Notice that in his immediate reaction, it was very bad in his eyes regarding his son. Now at the actual send-off, it doesn't say his son. It says the child. And it would seem that perhaps the text is hinting to us that Abraham, in order to emotionally do what he needs to do, he needs to distance himself a little. And therefore, he's looking at this child, 17-year-old child, as a yeled as opposed to as my son. All the commentators, from ancient to medieval to modern, are bothered by why does Abraham only give bread and water? And the Ibn Ezra questions, V'rabim yitzmahu me'Abraham, many are shocked by Abraham. Ech geresh b'no, gam shalach ben imo rekam, v'ayeni dvat libo. How could he send the mother and the child empty-handed? Where is the generosity? V'hatema me'ela sheyitzmahu. And the Ibn Ezra answers, they should be shocked about the question that they're asking. And he's going to offer two answers. The first answer is, Ki Abraham asa kechol asher tzivahu Hashem. Abraham did everything that God commanded. If he would have given money or treasures to Sarah, to Hagar, that would not have been what Sarah wanted. Lo shamar mitzvat Hashem. He would not have fulfilled God's command. And later on, he's going to give gifts. This answer is weak, meaning if he would have given something else in addition to bread and water, he would not have done what Sarah had asked. Sarah never stipulates with what he has to be sent away with. And the Ibn Ezra sensed this answer was weak, so he gives a second answer. And what does he say? And it would seem that she was also given what? Gold and silver, but the text doesn't tell us. Okay, so commentators are very bothered by only this bread and water. But we do see in this scene a gentleness on the side of Abraham. The Midrash says that more was given than just bread and water. The Midrash in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, as well as Targum Yonatan, says the following. And he took a veil, Abraham, and bound it around her waist, so it should drag her behind her to disclose the fact that she was a bondswoman. Not only this, but also because Abraham desired to see Ishmael, his son, and to see the way where they went. According to the Midrash, Abraham put a veil around her waist to leave a mark on the dirt, on the ground, on the sand, so that he could follow and that he could visit. So clearly in the eyes of the Midrash, they're looking at the word that we saw earlier, v'shiyishalcheha, lishloach, sending to as an extension of reach. Abraham desiring to keep in contact with his child. The Midrash goes on with a story. I'll read it to you because it was too long to write, about this extension of reach. This is Midrash Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, chapter 30. After 3 years, Abraham went to see Ishmael, his son, having sworn to Sarah that he would not descend from the camel in the place where Ishmael dwelt. Okay, he's not going to get off the camel. He arrived there at midday and found there the wife of Ishmael. He said to her, "Where is Ishmael?" She said to him, "He had gone with his mother to fetch the fruit of the palms." He said to her, "Give me a little bread and a little water, for my soul is faint after the journey in the desert." She said to him, "I have neither bread nor water." He said to her, "When Ishmael comes home, tell him the following story. A certain old man came from the land of Canaan to see him. And he said, 'Exchange the threshold of the house, for it is not good for thee.'" Meaning, according to the Midrash, asking for bread and water was a test. It was a bread and water test to see if Ishmael's wife was generous. And she wasn't. So he is hinting to his son that exchange the threshold of your home. When Ishmael came home, his wife told him the story. A son of a wise man is like half a wise man. Ishmael understood. His mother sent and took for him a wife from her father's house, and her name was Fatima. After another 3 years, Abraham went to see his son Ishmael, having sworn to Sarah, as on the first occasion, that he would not descend from the camel in the place where Ishmael dwelt. He came there at midday and found there Ishmael's wife. He said to her, "Where is Ishmael?" She replied to him, "He has gone with his mother to feed the camels in the desert." He said to her, "Give me a little more bread and water, for my soul is faint after the journey in the desert." She fetched it and gave it to him. Abraham arose and prayed before the Holy One, blessed be he, for only good things. When Ishmael came home, his wife told him what had happened, and Ishmael knew that his father's love was still extended to him. As it is said, like as a father pitieth his son. So clearly this Midrash is a Midrash. But this Midrash is a follow-up on what we saw. The clear distinction between Sarah's demand, Ligarish, and the actualization, Vayishalcheha. Now, I just want to show you 2 pieces of art and to see how differently it could be depicted, these scenes. This first scene, which I think is absolutely beautiful, is a very gentle scene. Look, we can see that Ishmael here is not 17 years old. He's a child. But look at Abraham's hand, gently about to pat his head. Abraham looking forward, not necessarily looking at Hagar, but looking off into the distance. There's sadness here, but yet there's gentleness, there's sensitivity, and there seems to be love. And I would say that perhaps the title that fits is Vayishalcheha at this. What about this picture? Okay, and I'd like just for a moment, if somebody would like just to open up their their microphone, and if you would tell me what you think about this scene. I know we could see it, you could view it in different ways. Would anyone want to volunteer and tell me what they see in this scene? There's no right answer. Art's in the eye of the one viewing.
The image actually reminds me of Lot's wife, facing one way and then kind of stuck in the in the present.
Okay, and looking down, right? Yeah. Anybody else in terms of what they view? Okay, I don't know. I see Abraham's finger pointing forward. Go. I see this as a much sadder scene, and I see this more as a scene of Gavrish. Okay, but that's up to how you view it. In any event, it's interesting that 2 artists depict our scene in 2 different ways, and we can actually see the nuances in the text themselves. We're now going to move on.
Lisa,
Yes.
is it possible that there is some kind of anti-Semitic message there where Avraham looks actually cruel and unfeeling, in the lack of humanity there?
Could be, but remember that Abraham is also the father of the Islamic nation as well. So it's hard to say anti-Semitism with Abraham because he's the one who fathers Ishmael.
Right.
So, right? So I think maybe not in this case. In other characters in Tanakh, certainly I would agree with you. Okay. So let's now move on to Hagar. Are there any other questions that someone wants to raise? Thank you for asking a question. It reminded me. Anyone else want to open their microphone and ask a question regarding what we learned until now? Okay, so we're going to move on to Hagar. Hagar is the most mysterious figure in our story. Very hard to get a grip on her personality. Let's see. וישכם אברהם בבוקר ויקח לחם וחמת מים ויתן אל הגר ותלך ותיטע במדבר. So he sends her off with bread and water, and she gets lost. She gets lost in the desert. ויכלו המים מן החמת, and the water dries up from the pouch. And she knows that this is it. When you have no more water in the desert, that's a sign that you're going to die. ותשלח את הילד תחת אחת השיחים. And she throws and she casts the child under one of the shrubs. And then she sits a distance away from the child. This
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
It's just I guess a question about Hagar earlier in the text. Where is she from, and what's her history, and what nation is she from?
She's from Egypt. We're going to get to that. She comes from Egypt. So therefore, it's a little bit surprising. I mean, it's a little bit surprising. Scholars they question, how is it that she got lost in the desert? She was a woman of the desert, but she's from Egypt. So So she throws the child under a shrub, and she's going to sit a distance away, and we'll see on the next slide that she doesn't want to be there when he dies. And clearly this is a very, very strange scene. Throwing a child under a shrub when the child is dehydrating and is going to die. All of us with our motherly instincts would say what you do is you hold your child, as painful as it is, and you hold them close. That word v'tashlech is very, very cruel. If we look in Tanakh, that word v'tashlech, to throw, to cast, we see regarding Joseph, that when the brothers see him and he comes near, okay, look, they take off his jacket, they take off that multicolored jacket, and they throw him into the pit. And we know that they're throwing him into the pit not for a good reason, right? That's the same verb that's used with Hagar, throwing the child. And a similar case is in Sefer Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu, he prophesied to the nation. They didn't like his prophecy. And what are we told? By Yirmiyahu, they throw him into the pit. Now, Benno Jacob, who is a famous German commentator, he's often quoted by Nechama Leibowitz. In his translation into German of the text, what does he write? She still carefully places the child in the shade. There's a mistake here, the child in the shade. This is not true. The word yashlichu is not places carefully. He writes that he feels it can't be to throw because that is not what a mother would do. So she throws the child, and her actions here seem to say that she is demoralized, Hagar. She's an abandoned woman. She's been thrown out. She's been expelled. The 17 years that she's had in the home of Abraham, it's as though they've just all disappeared. And she's reached a point where she no longer believes in life, and she certainly, maybe some of the anger that she feels for Abraham, she's transferred to Ishmael, okay, but she's thrown this child. Notice it doesn't use the word binah, but tashlech et binah, her son, but the word yeled, which is a more neutral term. Okay, so she throws this child under the shrubs, so he should have some shade. And then we're told, Batelech, Bateshev la mineged, and she sits across harchei kemetachavei keshet. The distance that she sits from herself and Ishmael is the distance that you shoot an arrow. Okay, that's quite a long distance. And this imagery of a bow and an arrow is also an imagery of war, of bloodshed. It is not a gentle scene here. This is a scene which has all this imagery of cruelty. So, and why does she do this? Ki amra al b'mot hayeled. I don't want to see the death of the child. Again, not my son, the death of the child. But teshev mineged, again we're told, and she sits across, away. Vatisa et kola vateft. And she cries.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
It's very moving, of course, this part, and it reminds me of Yonah, and in chapter 4 of the story of Yonah, when he his actual going to sit in the desert, and that kind of threat to his life, if I'm not mistaken, causes Hashem to bring the Kikayon.
Right. And there again,
is there a connection that actually that kind of lying in the desert hopelessness is some kind of call for divine, like for Hashem to save her?
I mean, certainly the idea of hopelessness connects our two stories. We're going to see that God is not going to want to save, the focus here is not going to be to save her, but it's going to be to save the child. And we're going to see that in the next slide. Okay, I agree with you. It's a good point, the connection between the two. So we have here the imagery of the bow and arrow, and Zvi Grummet, a colleague of ours, just put out a book on Genesis, and he says something very interesting regarding this imagery. He says, in the history of warfare, the invention of the bow and arrow must have been a momentous event, as warriors could now kill their enemies without having to experience their deaths close up. It is the ancient equivalent of using a remote-controlled drone to eliminate an enemy target. The controller sits far away, pushing buttons as if in a video game. The distance of a bow shot is the Bible's way of describing the death of Hagar's disengagement from her son's fate. Okay, disengagement, despair, despondent, given up in life. Okay, so she sits a distance away. We're going to return to this scene later on, this very, very unsettling scene in the depiction of Hagar. What's interesting is she says, I don't want to see the death of my child. If we go to the earlier story in chapter 16, we're going to see something very fascinating. In chapter 16, we have an emphasis on sight, on seeing. If you look, this is when she's first given over to Abraham for marriage. Okay, look in Pasuk Daled. I use colors to try to help you. And she saw that she's pregnant, and then her mistress was lowered in her eyes. And then she repeats it again in verse 5. And then she's going to run away because of Sarah's treatment of her. Look in Pasuk Zayin. She runs away to the desert, and then an angel will find her, Al Ein Hamayim, at a spring, Al Ein Ha'ayin B'derech Shur. Ayin and Ein are springs, underground springs of water, but it's the same word as a socket, like an eye socket, right? And then later on, so the angel is going to say to her, he has to convince her to go back. Notice, I underlined it for you. 4 times the angel will speak to her to try to convince her to go back to Sarah, and she will eventually at the end. And after this whole revelation and conversation with the angel, look at Pasuk Gimel. Vatikra Shem Hashem Hadover Ela. She names the angel that spoke to her. Ata El Roi. You are the God who sees me. Sight again, vision. Ki Amra Hagam Halom Ra'iti. She says, even here I see Acharei Roi, after you have seen me. And then she even names the Be'er, the well at that spot, Be'er Lachai Roi. Look at all this eye imagery, seeing imagery, and even more so. Go back now to verse 6, okay? When Sarah afflicts her, and look at the word to afflict. Vat'aneha Sarah, it's in the purple. Inui. Look at the letters of the word V'ta'aneha, similar to the word ayin. And it's not just arbitrary that this word was chosen. So all this imagery, okay, in the earlier story, in chapter 16, it's all about eyes and it's all about seeing. And behold, in our chapter 21, she cast the child and said, I can't see the death of the child. It's as though she's saying, I no longer believe in my vision. I no longer believe in my sight. I no longer believe in my intuition. All that I saw, all that I see is incorrect. And it's so interesting, the contrast between these two scenes. So what happens? So then God calls out, Vayishma Elokim, it's called Hanar. God hears the voice of the Na'ar. Miriam, that's what I mentioned earlier, that God is going to actually respond to the Na'ar, not necessarily to Hagar. Vayikra Malach Elokim El Hagar Min HaShamayim, an angel calls out to Hagar from the sky. Notice an angel again. No one in Genesis had so many angels speaking to them as Hagar. Right? And no other woman in Tanakh. Okay, it's really the contrast here is stark. Vayomer Lamalach Hagar, and he says, the angel says, what's with you, Hagar? Al Tir'i, don't be frightened. Kishamat Elokim et Kol Hanar, God has heard the voice of the lad, Ba'asher Sham, where he is. And here I think there's a subtle critique of what? Of Hagar. God hears his voice wherever he is, under that shrub where you threw him, wherever he is, God hears him. And now he instructs Hagar, Kumi, get up, Si'i et hanar, pick up the child, Hachziki et yadech bo, hold him, return to motherhood, overcome this moment of despair, of trauma, Kila goy gadol asimenu, because he will be the father of a big, large nation. And if we compare to the earlier promise given in chapter 16, when she ran away from Sarah's home and she's convinced to go back there, what does the angel tell him? Harba arbe et zarech. You will have your descendants will be great. You will not be able to count them. They'll be numerous. But here she's being told, not only will they be numerous, but they will be a nation. You will be a nation that's going to come from your child. And at that point, Vayivkach Elohim et eineha, God opens her eyes and she sees the well of water. Notice the word for God's opening her eyes. It doesn't say Vayivtach, it says Vayivkach. And we know that the root of the word Vayivkach is Pikeach, which also means intelligence. And earlier in Sefer Bereshit, Rashi, after Adam and Eve eat from Eitz Hada'at, and it says Vatipakachna einei shnehem, and their eyes were open. Notice the same root there. What does Rashi write? Le'inyan ha'chochma diber ha'katuv v'lo le'inyan re'iyah mamash. Okay, so her eyes are open. This is her empowering moment. This is the moment at which she takes hold of herself. She re-believes, perhaps this reinstates her belief in her vision, in how she views the world, and that God has not forsaken her. And from now, we're going to see that she's going to, in a sense, come back to whom she was, perhaps with changes. She fills the jug with water, and she gives water to the lad. And God is with the lad, and he grows. And he sits in the desert, and he becomes an archer. He settles in the desert. And she finds a wife for Ishmael from Egypt. Notice she is finding the wife. Generally in Tanakh, it's the father finding the wife. Abraham sends his Eved, Eliezer, to find a wife for Yitzchak. Rivka turns to Yitzchak and says, send Yaakov to Haran in order to find a wife. But there is no father. They've been expelled from Abraham's home. And at this point, Hagar is back on her feet. She has returned to being a mother, as much of a mother as she is, and she takes over the reins and she finds a wife for him from Eretz Mitzrayim, from where she came from. And so we see that the thematic frame regarding Hagar is Mitzrayim. We started out in chapter 16 when Sarah gives her as a handmaiden to Abraham. We're told Shivcha Mitzrit, an Egyptian maidservant. And in chapter 21, she goes back to Eretz Mitzrayim, where she will find a wife for Ishmael. And it's as though she has become empowered. She's back on her feet. She has now reconnected with her roots, now that she's no longer in the home of Abraham. I'm just pointing out on an aside, for those that are interested, that feminist literature has a lot to say about Hagar. They look at her as the abused, abandoned woman who learns to get up on her feet. Not only is it important feminist literature of the Bible, but also remember that she comes from Egypt, and that means she has dark skin. So in terms of the Black empowered woman. So there's a lot of literature out there for those that are interested in reading about it. So this is our last official glimpse of Hagar in the Torah. In chapter 25, she'll be mentioned in passing when we're told the genealogy of Ishmael. But with this, we close. It's interesting that the Midrash links Hagar to another figure. And that we know that after Sarah dies, Abraham marries another wife whose name is Keturah. And he's going to have children from this Keturah, and at the end, he actually sends them free. He sends them with gifts. And what does Chazal say regarding Keturah? So Hagar. And why is she Hagar? V'nikrei Keturah al shem na'im ma'aseh k'ktoret. Why is she called Keturah? She's really Hagar because her ways are as beautiful as incense. V'shekashra patcha, and she closed off her sexual organ. Shaloni davga la'adam miyom sheparsha me'Abraham. She didn't have relations with anyone from the day that she left Abraham. The second line, the fact that she closed off her organ, is based on the word katar in Ivrit, is kashar in Aramaic. The tet becomes a shin, and that's the hint to the fact that the connection between these two words. Interesting that the second verse here is connecting again to sexual relations. In any event, Chazal equate Keturah with Hagar. Why? We know that very often Chazal equate anonymous figures in Tanakh with one another, with some known. But why two figures that have a name? I can't give you one specific reason, but I can say that perhaps A, it preserves the kavod of Abraham, that at the end of his life, after Sarah dies, he doesn't take an additional wife, but rather he returns to the wife that he had. And additionally, we could say that perhaps it's a focus on Hagar. How is it possible, in the eyes of Chazal, that Hagar could have lived 17 years in Abraham's home, 17 years witnessing day to day his act, the way he acted, and not be touched by his actions? And notice what they say here, that her ma'aseha na'im, her ways are nice. Right? So perhaps, and additionally, the fact that so many angels came to speak to Hagar, how is it possible that they didn't touch her in some way? So we're not exactly sure why, but Chazal do equate the two, and Keturah is Hagar. Nechama Leibowitz points out a beautiful stylistic note regarding our chapter. It's not in her books on Sefer Breshit, it's in a separate article that she wrote. And she says that if we look carefully at the names, the way the different characters in the story describe Ishmael, we can understand the relationship with him. After all, his name is Ishmael, but no one calls him Ishmael. Sarah calls him Ben Hagar HaMitzrit, the son of the Egyptian woman. And we see here the disdain that Sarah feels for this child because of the influence that he has on Yitzchak. If we look down on the bottom of the chart, we see what Abraham looks at him as Beno, my son, because that's how he feels for him. This is my son. Hagar looks at him calls him Hayeled, the child, because we saw that the distancing that Hagar has with this child, whereas God calls him Hanar, the lad, because that's truly what he is. He's a lad and he's 17 years old. We're going to now move on to Ishmael. I'm going to stop a moment if anyone has any questions regarding Hagar or any comments that they want to make. Happy to hear. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Ishmael, our last character. So how does our chapter begin? He's playing some kind of activity which we saw was improper. There's a range of views how improper it was. And then as a result of this playing, what happens? Abraham has to send him out. And he sends him out of the house. And then later on in our chapter, what are we told? Hagar throws him under one of the shrubs. Notice the similarity between the two words, vayishalcheha, vatashlich. One from the shoresh shalach, to send, shin lamed chet, and the other from the shoresh, from the root shin lamed chaf, to cast or to throw. Change of one letter. But in a sense, what's happening here? If we put ourselves in the place of Ishmael, Ishmael has been sent out of his father's home, and he has been sent out of his mother's arms. And if we place ourselves in Ishmael's place, in his footsteps, he's in a sense been abandoned by both of his parents. Both have left him. Both have abandoned him. And that's why, after being abandoned by Hagar, at that point, what does the text tell us? Vayishma Elokim et kol hana'ar. God hears his voice. Yishmael started off with mitzachek, but through the experiences of chapter 21, his mitzachek, his laughter and his childish behavior has turned to a call, has turned to a voice emanating from his heart, a voice filled with sincerity, a voice of wanting to be saved. And at that point, when God hears his voice, the voice of Ishmael, his true call for salvation, Vahi Elokim et Hana'ar, God is with him, Vayigdal, and he grows, and he sits in the desert, and he becomes a craftsman, a bow and arrow, an archer. And in a sense, what is our story portray? What we say in the David Hashem Ori every morning. Ki avi ve'imi azavuni. My mother and father have abandoned me. Hashem yasvini. But God, you have drawn me in. You have brought me close. You have saved me. And this, I believe, this is a formative moment in his life. He is now reborn. At that point, when he cries out to God and God hearkens to his voice, he is reborn. He understands He has a connection with God. He understands his mission. There's a fascinating parallel, which I discovered online, written by Penina Gelpaz Geller, an interesting Bible scholar. I have some of her books, where she compares Ishmael and Moshe Rabbeinu. What is the comparison between the two? Let's look together. Both of them were in danger of death. Ishmael, dehydration. Moshe, we know, the decrees in Egypt. In both cases, the mother separates from the child. Ishmael is thrown under the bush by his mother, and Moshe's mother, as we know, places him in the basket. Both, we have a botanical setting. With Ishmael, we're told he's placed under one of the bushes. And with Moshe, we're told Vatasem et hayeled basuf, and he's put into the reeds. Notice that in both cases where we're talking about placing him somewhere, we have the use of the word yeled. In both stories, there's an emphasis on distance. With Ishmael, we know that she sits mineged harchek kemetachavei keshet, the distance of a bow shooting an arrow. And regarding Moshe, his sister, Vatetatzeir achoto merachok, she's waiting from afar to know what's going to happen with him. The same root, rachak. In both cases, the children's cry brings salvation. With Ishmael, Vayishma Elohim et kol hana'ar, God hears the call of the lad. And regarding Moshe, V'hinei na'ar boche, the child, the lad is crying, and she, Vataro Vatachmol alav. And notice here, in the salvation scene, the crying scene, they're both described by the same term, na'ar. Okay, earlier was yeled, and now is both na'ar. And both have this connection to Egypt. So we see a clear parallel between these two scenarios, between these two narratives. It's as though when Hashem is writing and dictating to Moshe Sefer Shemot, in the back of his mind, Kivyachol, he's thinking of the story of Ishmael. But we know that whenever we have a biblical parallel, we have to not only look at what's similar, but also what's different. And I see two very clear differences between our two stories. The first difference is the separation of mother from child. In the case of Ishmael, it wasn't necessary. It didn't have to be done. She chose to do it. Whereas with Moshe, it had to be done in order to save Moshe's life. And the second difference, of course, is the verb used to describe putting him under the shrubbery. With Ishmael, it's vatashleich. Ishmael, it's a very crass word to throw, whereas with Moshe, vatasem, it's very gentle. So clearly this parallel is teaching us that Moshe, the behavior of Moshe's mother, is a contrast to the behavior of Ishmael's mother. But yet, even so, what is this biblical parallel coming to teach us? It's coming to teach us that separation is the catalyst for growth. Both national leaders, Ishmael, the national leader of the Ishmaelite nation, and Moshe, the Jewish people, grew to their potential because there was separation. It's as though separation was needed for them to reach their potential. And looking at it in that way, I reframe how I look at Hagar. Yes, in contrast to Moshe's mother, there's a negative contrast here. But yet, if we look at the narrative, look at the whole narrative, Sefer Breshit and Sefer Shemot, it makes me look a little bit differently in terms of Hagar. Okay, this separation was needed in order for Ishmael to become who he was going to become. Ishmael internalizes at a certain point this idea that he needed to be separated from both his mother and his father. And I think that's why he's able to maintain healthy contacts with his previous family, with the family of Yitzchak. After all, we know that when Rivka comes with Eved Abraham to come back to marry Yitzchak, we have this reunion, okay, in chapter 24, and that's when she falls off the camel. Look at the first pasuk. Vatakom Rivka v'na'arotea v'tirkavna al hagmalim v'tilachna acharei ha'ish. She follows the man. Vayikach ha'eved et Rivka vayelech, and they're coming. V'yitzchak ba mibo, and Yitzchak is coming towards them. The air lachai ro'i, in the well of lachai ro'i. That's where the meeting takes place between Yitzchak and Rivka. What is this be'er lachai ro'i? The well of the God, the living God who saw me. That's the same be'er, that's the same well that was named by Hagar earlier in our story. When we saw all the eyeballs Okay, that's the same Be'er. That's where they're uniting. That means that this relationship between Yitzchak and Ishmael was a healthy one, because this area of Be'er L'chai Ro'i was an area that was under the jurisdiction of Ishmael. Additionally, what do we see? At the end, when Abraham dies and it's time to bury him, look at Pasuk Tet. Vayikberu oto Yitzchak v'Yishmael banav el ma'arat ha'machpelah el Sde Ephron. Yitzchak and Ishmael bury Abraham. And Rashi notes regarding the word order Yitzchak v'Yishmael, Mikan she'asa Yishmael tshuva v'holich et Yitzchak lefanav v'hi seva tova she'nemar b'Avraham. And here we see that what? That Yishmael did tshuva, and this is the ripe old age. What's important here is the idea that Yitzchak is given the right to go first. Yishmael realizes that I have my place, I understand what my job is, and therefore I can let Yitzchak go before me. And he keeps his connections going regarding the home of Abraham, and he is okay with his position regarding the home and the lineage of Abraham. So what have we seen today? We've seen the expulsion story. We've looked at different vantage points. And now I want to go back to our original question. We clearly saw that the connection to Rosh Hashanah and our Torah reading is the very beginning words, and God remembered Sarah. But I believe that there's an additional message that we can learn that we've learned this morning. And first of all, we've seen that our story of the expulsion is really a story of separation. Separation which is accompanied by tremendous pain by all those involved, pain by all of them, Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael. If the pain is a catalyst for internal growth, change, and rebirth, the amount of change, the type of change in each character is different, but there is a change that transpires in the hearts of each and every one of them as a result of the story. And how are they able to change, and how are they able to grow? Because they understand that God is with them, that God is accompanying them. After all, Abraham, God tells him directly, listen to Sarah, but I will make him a great nation. He will not be forsaken. Regarding Hagar, we saw angels, and all the promises that she's given by God. And lastly, Ishmael, who as a result of being abandoned by both his parents, he calls out to God, and in a sense, my God and my father and mother have forsaken me, but God, like God, has drawn me near. And I believe that, we too, all of us, have experienced pain this year. We enter the new year, Rosh Hashanah, with tremendous hesitation, doubt, the unknown. And when we hear the Torah reading on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, we might be sitting under a tree in a shul at home. But I hope that we can focus on on what's being read, and we can try to learn from what's being read and try to channel our pain and our fear towards self-growth and change. Each and every one of us have our own personal trajectory of change and growth. But it will be healthy and helpful to us to try to channel all of the unknown in terms of look into ourselves and see how all this pain and the unknown, how we can do it, how we can use it and utilize it to build ourselves. Of course, knowing that God is there accompanying us and God is there behind the scenes. Yes, there are no angels like in the story of Hagar. Yes, God does not speak to us directly like Abraham, but we know that God is with us. We know that God is with the Jewish people and that we will come out of this difficult situation. I hope when you sit there on Rosh Hashanah and you hear the story of the expulsion, these words will come to life, and the characters will come to life, and the human drama will come to life, and that will give us strength in our own personal lives. So with that, I want to wish Shana Tova. I want to open up and see if there are any questions. Hold on, I want to see your pictures again. I will close all your pictures. Did anyone want to ask any questions regarding what we learned this morning? Yes, Miriam.
It was absolutely fascinating and moving, and I've learned so much. Thank you. I'm left with one question, which is clearly too big and beyond the scope of today, which is how are we meant to relate now with this knowledge to Sarah?
Okay, so you should know that when I was building the shiur, I originally built it differently. And I wanted to show that there was, I'll just tell you, there's also growth with Sarah herself, but that growth is when you compare chapter 16 to chapter 21. In chapter 16, she sends Hagar away. I ended up not doing it because I felt like, you know, I'm biting off more than I can chew. It's too many characters. It's going to be too confusing. In chapter 16, but thank you for your question. It's very important. Chapter 16, maybe next year we'll talk about Sarah. In chapter 16, she sends Hagar away for a personal reason. She has been demeaned in Hagar's eyes. Whereas in chapter 21, she sends Hagar away because not about her, it's not about herself. It's not about her honor. It's not about her kavod. It's about the legacy of Abraham. And she has grown from her personal concern to a national concern. So I see extreme growth with Sarah. And in addition, we have the whole ancient Near East milieu that we have to keep in mind when reading that story. I want to just point out that, any other questions? I just want to let everybody know that I will be giving a shiur in Mirza Hashem and the Beit Midrash this year. It's going to be called Uncovering Her Story. It's a playoff on the word history, which is like his story, her story. And we'll be looking at sister and daughter narratives in the Torah. The style of learning will be similar to today. It will be very, very textually based, as well as looking at the milieu of the ancient world at the same time. So I hope that some of you will join me in our journey throughout the year. And I hope that when we're sitting there on Rosh Hashanah, wherever we're going to be and we read the story, it's going to be a lot more meaningful for us, you know, and its connection with Rosh Hashanah.
Thank you very much, Lisa.
Okay, thank you.
I put up the schedule here for next year's classes so you can see. Lisa will be teaching on Wednesdays in our second slot from 10:15 to 11:15 on Wednesday mornings. Be'ezrat Hashem, next week we will have registration open. I will send everybody all the details and you can start planning your year. We're starting right after the Chagim and we're very excited about the schedule. So you can take a look at it here and I'll be in touch. I have all your emails from this shiur and we'll send you everything.
Great. Okay. Shana Tova to everybody.
Thank you, Shana Tova.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shana Tova.